If you're a fan of the V8 engine that Henry Ford put into his 1932 Model A, and I mean, who isn't? Well, then you need to thank this car right here, the 1929 Chevrolet. This is the car that made it all happen. Hi there, Richard Brule with another chapter in the automotive evolution here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars from just about every automotive decade. Tell all kinds of interesting stories. And this one right here, this 1929 Chevrolet AC International is a very important chapter there. And to talk about that, we need to go back just a little bit earlier. We need to talk about Henry Ford. Of course, in 1908, he came out with a Model T that really rocked the automotive industry. And he built the same basic car from 1908 all the way up to 1927 because he was convinced that's all America wanted. Well, in the meantime, Chevrolet and some of the other manufacturers were starting to build cars that were more comfortable, a little more fashionable. They were just a little more advanced technologically. And as a result, eventually, well, Henry Ford had to literally shut down the Model T production line to come out with the Model A. And the Model A in 1928 was an absolutely great car. But Chevrolet had a trick up its sleeve. While it came out with a new car in 1928 to rival the Model A, it decided to come out with something the following year that was going to be completely different. Well, at least under the hood in the engine compartment. Now, I should tell you that Chevrolet actually came out with their first V8 engine in 1917. They actually built it from 1917 through 1919. To be honest with you, it was complicated. It had a number of issues, it had more performance, but it just wasn't what people wanted at the time. In 1929, what they decided to do with this car right here was not come out with another 8-cylinder engine or a V8 engine. They decided to come out with a 6-cylinder engine that was going to produce more power than what Ford was producing. And significantly, their big pitch was the fact that this 6-cylinder engine was basically in the price range of a 4. You only paid $10 more to get a 6-cylinder engine that gave you more performance. So why is this Chevrolet so important to the development of the V8 from Ford? Well, it's because the performance war was on, and Henry Ford is somewhat famously remembered as having said something to the effect of, if it's cylinders they want, we'll give them more. As a result, Ford developed the V8 engine that then went into the 1932 Model A that became a favorite for hot rodders and people who wanted more performance for an awful long time. Now, Chevrolet decided to stick with the 6-cylinder engine. In fact, they kept it for a really long time, all the way up into the 1960s. We'll talk more about that engine in just a moment. But it's important to point out that this car right here is what ramped up the game in performance in 1929 for Chevy versus Ford. So this is the engine that fired the shot heard round Detroit, this 6-cylinder that came out in 1929 for Chevrolet. It's nicknamed the Stove Bolt 6, and the reason being it has these bolts that they used across the engine that looked like they came off stoves back in those days. And to be honest with you, that was not a name you really wanted, but this turned out to be such a durable engine, and it did so well that Stove Bolt 6 actually became kind of a good name for this. It's important to point out that when this engine came out in 1929, it had 11 more horsepower than they had the year before. It had 46 horses. The year before, with the 4-cylinder, they only had 35. So you have to realize that was a massive bump up in power from an engine that was basically 194 cubic inches. Now, the General Motors world had actually come out with a 6-cylinder engine just a little bit before this for Pontiac and Oakland. This is not the same engine, but it's kind of derived from that. Some of the same people were involved in making this engine. And it was such a solid design that the first generation of this went up through, I think, 1936. And then they made a second generation of the same basic engine that went all the way up through 1962. They kept figuring out ways to improve it, get more horsepower out of it. As a result, this engine had a really, really long life. And it was pretty economical too. I mean, back in those days, it was getting 19 miles to the gallon, which was pretty significant. On the other side, there's a single carburetor over there. It's got a mechanical fuel pump. So in many ways, it was a very modern engine. As we said, in just a few years, Ford would come out with the V8. But Chevy decided to stick with this for an awful long time because, quite frankly, it worked really, really well. It's important to point out that when they built the 1928 Chevrolet, they were obviously thinking that this was the plan to put this engine in here because they didn't actually have to come up with a whole new chassis. They didn't have to stretch anything. The wheelbase for the 1928 was probably a little longer than it needed to be for the 4-cylinder engine that was in here, because they were planning to put this in. As you can see, it's really close up here to the radiator, goes all the way to the back. They've got to have that little punch out to make it fit. But this is the engine they were planning on putting in here and making sure that this would be the engine of the future and the engine that would fit perfectly into this 1929 chassis. Let's walk around and take a closer look at the 1929 Chevrolet AC International. Now, this replaced the one-year model, which was the AB International that had come out the year before. And while it's very similar in an awful lot of ways, it's also different in subtle ways. For example, this grille right here. The grille on the 1929 is a little more rectangular shaped. In 1928, it actually kind of flared out at the bottom. One of the really significant things that happened in 1928 was the fact that they were using 30-inch wheels. So for 1929, they opted for 20-inch stamped steel wheels. The result was this car looked lower. It rode just a little bit lower, which you've got to remember, roads were starting to get better. You didn't need quite as much ground clearance as you had in the past. So the idea of the fact that the car was, well, just a little bit lower looking made it look a little more impressive to a lot of the people who wanted to buy it. By the way, one of the things that was standard this year, and it's almost hard to believe, were bumpers. Up until this point, bumpers had been an option for cars. For 1929, the AC International, this car right here, made it standard. Now, this is what they call the Phaeton body style. The Phaeton body style is open in the back. You could also get various other types of body styles that were enclosed and kept you a little bit more comfortable. This was the least expensive of that line. Of course, tail lights were a brand new adventure back then. This, of course, is the trunk. You know, you think of the trunk as simply being something that sits on the back of the car, but in the old days, it literally was a trunk that sat on the back. One significant thing that they have, and we'll see if we can go all the way to the bottom and look underneath the car, this is what they call the banjo rear end right there. See how it looks like a banjo round? It's what we're used to today. This was the way things began to go. The suspension was also probably a little bit better on the Chevrolet compared to the Ford. Having said that, the Ford Model A was a stalwart. It sold big numbers over a long period of time. Chevrolet didn't need to sell as many because you got to remember they were part of GM. GM was selling Buicks, they were selling Pontiacs, they were selling Oaklands back in those days, so they didn't need to sell as many, but still, this Chevrolet was a groundbreaker. Now, I will mention that in many ways it was very similar to the car that came before it. It was stamped steel over a wooden frame, which is one of the reasons a lot of these cars don't survive very well, because those wooden frames would rot out, and as a result, trying to save them was pretty difficult. To be honest with you, getting into the 1929 Chevrolet is a little bit on the tight side for somebody like me. I'm 6 feet tall. To be honest with you, inside it's pretty cramped. I mean, you almost feel like you're in a kiddie car in some theme park. But once again, it was sufficient, it was enough, and it was more comfortable than the, for example, the Model Ts had been in their day. It was also more advanced in a lot of ways. I mean, the way the dashboard was laid out with the gauges, all the instrumentation right there, you actually for the first time had a theft-proof ignition lock, which was really important. You had the choke cable, you had an ammeter, you had all the simple things that you needed to make sure that you actually knew how the car was running. Importantly, one of the things they also started to do with the pedals down below was to make sure that they were sealed off from the outside. So if it was rainy, if there was water on the road, it wasn't coming into the engine compartment. This steering wheel is 17 inches around, and that's pretty big, but you also have to remember, there was no power steering back in those days. So you actually needed the diameter of the wheel to be able to make the turn as you were going along. It has a windshield wiper. Think about how bold that was back in those days. Now, to be honest with you, I can't imagine it did a very good job of wiping off the windshield. First off, it was only on one side, not an awful lot. Significantly, there was another change that happened for the 1929 year, and that was the fact that they slimmed down what we call the A-pillar, this right here. And the reason being is the slimmer it is, the less it blocks vision. In fact, that was one of their advertising points back then, was they had a slimmer A-pillar and therefore wasn't blocking the road as much, so you can see. This one is the Phaeton, which was actually it was the cheapest model. There were two different ones that you could buy that year that were the cheapest model, but this was $525. had a cloth roof, and at that point people were beginning to think maybe we didn't really want the cloth roof anymore. Yeah, it's great, on a nice sunny warm pleasant day, but a lot of people around the country were having to drive these all year round, and having a cloth top without side curtains, that wasn't what you wanted. The idea of the coupe, the idea of the sedan, those were coming into popularity. By the way, tons of room in the back of this Phaeton version. Look at the leg room. I mean, it just kind of goes on and on. But you have to remember, there was no official trunk like we're used to. So anything you were carrying, you would have to stick in the back, supposedly with your passengers as well. So having extra room back there was really important. By the way, where do we get the word phaeton? Well, it actually predates automobiles. It goes back to the horse and buggy days. A phaeton was an open buggy, and that's why this phaeton is somewhat open. But the name itself actually goes back to Greek mythology. Phaeton, or Phaethon, was the son of Helios, the sun god. And one day he borrowed his father's chariot. Yes, I think you've heard this story before. And he drove a little too close to the earth, causing Zeus to strike him down. Odd way to name a fun car, but what the heck? There were several different passenger versions of the 1929 models that were available. There was the Phaeton and the Roadster. Those were both available for $525. Next step up was either the Coupe at $595 or the Coach at $595, both enclosed, which was really important. The sedan was $675. From there, well, you were getting a little sportier with the Sport Cabriolet at $695. And the most luxurious, if you could call it that, of the day for the Chevrolet line was a $725 convertible Landau. Now, there were also truck chassis that were available as well for 1929. So if Chevrolet ramped up the performance wars with this engine back in 1929, why didn't they follow suit when Ford went to the V8 in 1932? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. The first was they kept evolving and making this engine into something better over time. The first generation, as I mentioned, went from 1929 up to 1936. 1937, they came out with the next generation that basically went all the way until 1962. They kept improving the horsepower output of it as time went along. In fact, you may remember the later versions of this engine with a different name, not the Stovebolt 6, but the Blue Flame 6. It's right, the same engine that's in the first generation of the Corvette evolved from this engine right here. The other thing was, well, you got to remember that times were rough in the 30s after the Depression that hit in 1929. Keeping this engine in here and just evolving it enabled them to keep the cost of this down. So as a result, during the 1930s, and they were selling fewer cars, they didn't have to invest as much money. And you got to remember that the Chevrolet was designed to be the entry level in the GM world, where Ford only had one model. The General Motors world, well, I mean, they had all those different brands. They had Oakland, they had Pontiac, they had Chevrolet, they had Buick, they had Oldsmobile, and of course they had the Cadillac and LaSalle world. So keeping a six-cylinder engine in this car made sense as an entry level for car buyers in the United States. But the six-cylinder engine in this car, boy, I tell you what, it rocked Ford, it rocked the world in many ways, and it made it really clear that no one was going to settle anymore for four-cylinder engines that just didn't have a lot of performance back in 1929.